The gun was already pressed to her daughter's temple when Sheriff Isaac Mercer finally kicked open the saloon doors. The room went dead silent. 40 men, maybe more, all holding their breath, all watching the only man in Caldwell County who had ever made outlaws genuinely afraid. But Isaac Mercer did not look afraid. He never looked anything at all. That was the terrifying part. His face was carved from the same red stone as the canyon walls outside of town, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard rolls in and buries everything alive. "Put the child down, Holt," Isaac said. Not shouted. Said. The way you say a thing when you already know how it ends. Delilah Holt had his meaty forearm around the little girl's waist, his revolver jammed sideways against the child's temple like a period at the end of a sentence. The girl was no more than 4 years old. She had dark curls matted with dust, and her small hands were wrapped around Delilah Holt's forearm, not clawing, not scratching, just holding on, because she was too young to understand that holding on sometimes means holding on to the very thing that means to kill you. And then the woman came forward. Isaac had not noticed her at first, which was saying something because Isaac Mercer noticed everything. She pushed through the men near the bar with her elbows, and her voice came out like cracked porcelain, shattered but still somehow holding its shape. "Please," she said, and that single word carried more weight than any gunshot Isaac had heard in his 11 years wearing a badge. "Please, she is all I have left." Her name was Faye Dalton, though Isaac did not know that yet. He did not know anything about her yet. He only knew that she was the most desperate human being he had ever laid eyes on, and he had laid eyes on plenty of desperate people. And something moved in his chest that had not moved in years, something old and locked and covered in rust. He did not let it show. He took 3 steps forward, and the spurs on his boots rang out like a church bell in the silence. "I will not ask again," he said to Delilah Holt. Holt's eyes were bright and wild with whatever he had been drinking. "You take one more step, Mercer, and I will paint the floor with this little girl's." "No," Isaac said, "you will not." He drew in the same motion as the word, and the barrel of his Colt was already level before Holt had even processed that the sheriff had moved. Every man in the room held perfectly still. The little girl made a small sound, a tiny bird-like sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. And then, impossibly, she turned her face toward Isaac Mercer. She looked right at him with enormous brown eyes, the same deep brown as river water in autumn, and she reached out her small hand toward him across the distance of the room as though she had known him her whole short life, as though he were safe. As though in the middle of all this smoke and danger and ruin, he was the only solid thing left standing. Something broke open inside Isaac Mercer. He could feel it happen, the way you can feel a dam give way before the water actually comes through. Something cracked right down the center of the locked and rusted thing in his chest, and he hated it, because he had worked 11 years to build that wall, and 4 small fingers just took it apart in less than 3 seconds. He kept his face like stone, but the aim of his gun never wavered. It had not always been like this in Dustfall, Texas. In the summer of 1882, Dustfall was just beginning to grow into something beyond a cattle stop. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and with it came merchants and families and preachers and gamblers and criminals, the whole messy catalog of humanity that trails along behind progress like dust behind a wagon wheel. The town had a school now, and a telegraph office, and a hotel with 2 floors, and a sheriff with a reputation that stretched from here to the Oklahoma Territory. Isaac Mercer had been appointed sheriff of Dustfall at 31 years old after the previous sheriff, a decent man named Garfield, had taken a bullet in the throat during a bank robbery that went wrong. Isaac had been deputy then, and he had chased the robbers into the canyon lands north of town and brought back 3 of them in handcuffs and 1 of them over his saddle. And the town council had looked at him and seen in him something they desperately needed, which was the capacity for absolute, unshakable nerve. What the town council did not see, because Isaac made certain they did not see it, was what had made him that way. He was 34 now, and he had been running from the event that had calcified his heart for just over 5 years, and he was very good at it, because running from something and pursuing something look nearly identical when you are doing it on horseback in the open country. He had loved a woman once. Her name had been Clara, and she had been his wife for 2 years, and she had died in childbirth along with their son on a night in April when the doctor was 3 towns over, and there was nothing Isaac could do except hold her hand and listen to the world end. He had buried them both on a Sunday, and on Monday he had gone back to work, because there was no other option, because stopping meant feeling it, and feeling it would have destroyed him completely. He had loved them so much that losing them had turned love itself into something dangerous, something to be avoided, something he regarded the way a man regards a fire that has already burned his house down. He understood fire. He respected fire. He kept his distance from fire. This was who he was on the morning that Faye Dalton rode into Dustfall on a borrowed mule with her daughter asleep against her chest, and nothing in her saddlebag but a change of clothes, a handful of coins, and a secret so heavy it had bent her nearly in half. Faye was 28 years old, though she looked both younger and older than that depending on the moment. When she was laughing, which she did when she forgot not to, she looked about 19. When she was frightened, which was often since she had left San Antonio 6 weeks ago, she looked ageless in the way that suffering makes people ageless. She had dark hair and darker eyes and a quality of stillness about her that was not the stillness of a calm person, but the stillness of a person who has learned to move very carefully so as not to draw attention. Her daughter was named Lily. Lily Dalton was 4 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, which was not a quality Faye thought fondly of any more, given what the man attached to that chin had turned out to be. Thomas had died 6 months ago, not at anyone's hand in particular, or so the official account said, though Faye knew better. Thomas had gotten greedy and skimmed off Cross's cut, and Cross had done what Cross always did when someone betrayed him. He had made an example. The problem was that Thomas, in his greediness and his cowardice, had written down everything. Every transaction, every name, every payment. He had kept the ledger hidden in a flour tin in the kitchen, and he had told Faye about it the night before he died, which meant that Cutter Cross knew she knew, and which meant that Faye Dalton and her daughter were worth more dead than alive. She had run. What else could she do? 6 weeks and 4 towns later, she rolled into Dustfall on a borrowed mule with the ledger sewn into the lining of her coat and a child who had not complained once about any of it, which broke Faye's heart in a specific and irreparable way, because a 4-year-old should not know to be so quiet and so still and so brave. She tied the mule outside the livery stable and stood in the street with Lily on her hip and looked at Dustfall, Texas, and thought, "This will do for now. It will have to do for now." She found the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Eugenia Park, who was a small, formidable widow of 60 who reminded Faye of a compressed spring, all coiled strength and practicality. Mrs. Park did not ask many questions, which Faye appreciated. She asked one, which was whether the child had a cough, because she did not permit coughs on account of her own condition, and Faye said no, and Mrs. Park showed her a room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the street and a lock on the door that actually worked. And Faye almost wept from the simple luxury of a lock that worked. She had $3.40 left. She needed a job by the end of the week. She also needed to figure out what to do with the ledger in her coat lining, because carrying Cutter Cross's entire criminal record on her person at all times was the kind of thing that aged a person considerably. It was on her second day in Dustfall, while she was inquiring about work at the general store owned by a man named Mr. Ambrose Finley, that she first saw Isaac Mercer. He walked past the store window like weather moves through a landscape, purposeful and indifferent and larger than the space around him, though he was not an especially large man. He was tall and lean in the way of men who are always moving, always working, never stopping long enough to go soft. He wore a dark coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather and a badge that caught the morning light, and his face was expressionless in a way that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "That is Sheriff Mercer," Mr. Finley said, without Faye asking. "Best lawman between here and Fort Worth, they say. Came here 3 years ago and cleaned this town out like nobody's business. You would not believe what Dustfall looked like before he got here." "He looks serious," Faye said. "Oh, he is serious," Finley said. "Deadly serious. Good man, though." "Good man. Just not a warm one, if you take my meaning." Faye took his meaning. She also thought that warm was not something she was particularly looking for right now. She was looking for safety and employment, and a place where Cutter Cross's men would not find her and her daughter for at least a few months while she figured out what to do. She got the job at the general store. Finley needed a counterwoman on account of his hands, shaking too badly to count change accurately anymore. And Faye was precise and quick with numbers, and Lily could sit behind the counter on a cushion without causing trouble, so it worked out for everyone. She settled into Dustfall with the careful efficiency of a woman who has learned not to settle into anything too completely. She learned the streets and the shortcuts. She learned which buildings backed up against the alley that connected to the livery stable, and which windows faced east and which faced west. And she knew exactly how long it would take her to grab Lily and reach the back door of the boarding house from any point in the store. This was not paranoia, she told herself. This was simply being prepared. This was simply being a mother. She saw Isaac Mercer 3 more times in that first week without speaking to him. He was always moving, always watchful, always alone. She noticed that people greeted him with a respect that bordered on deference, and that he acknowledged their greetings with nods rather than words, and that he never stopped moving long enough to become part of a conversation. He was present everywhere and absent entirely at the same time. She thought she understood that. She did something similar herself. The first time they actually spoke was on a Thursday, exactly 9 days after she arrived in Dustfall, when Lily wandered away from behind the counter at the general store, while Faye was helping an elderly man find a size of boot nail he had been describing in progressively more creative ways for 7 minutes. And Faye turned around and found the cushion empty and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach with a totality that was physical, like falling from a height. She found her 40 seconds later, outside on the boardwalk, standing in front of Isaac Mercer. The sheriff had been walking past the store and apparently nearly stepped on the child, who had come out the door while he was passing, and had stopped. He was looking down at Lily, the way you look at something unexpected, not unkindly, but with the wariness of a man who has not had much experience with small children recently, and is not certain what the appropriate response is. Lily was looking up at him with no wariness whatsoever, which was terrifying given the circumstances of their lives. "Lily," Faye said, coming through the door and catching her daughter's hand, "I told you not to leave the store." Pretty badge, Lily said, pointing up at Isaac Mercer. Something moved across Isaac's face, something very quick and very complicated that was gone before Faye could properly read it. He looked up at Faye. "She belongs to you," he said. "It was not a question. Yes, I am sorry if she startled you." "She did not startle me." A pause. "I am not easily startled." "I imagine not." Another pause. He looked at Lily, who was still pointing at his badge with the absolute confidence of a child who believes the world exists to satisfy her curiosity. Then he looked back at Faye. "You are the woman working at Finley's," he said. "Faye Dalton." "Yes. You arrived recently." She looked at him steadily. "Last week. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "I make it my business to know who comes into Dustfall." "And who leaves?" she said, without thinking about it. Something in his expression shifted barely perceptibly. "And who leaves?" he agreed. He touched the brim of his hat, which she would learn was the closest thing he did to a social courtesy, and walked on down the boardwalk without looking back. Faye stood in the sun for a moment with her hand around Lily's, watching him go, and felt something she had not felt since before Thomas had ruined everything, which was the faint and inconvenient awareness that a specific person existed in the world. She pushed it down immediately, firmly, like closing a trunk and sitting on the lid. Lily tugged her hand. "Mama," the man did not smile. "Not everyone smiles, sweetheart." "Why not?" Faye looked down the boardwalk where Isaac Mercer had already turned a corner and disappeared. "Sometimes people have reasons," she said. The weeks that followed developed a shape. Faye worked at the general store 6 days a week and spent the evenings at Mrs. Park's boarding house, where she had gotten into the habit of helping with dinner in exchange for a small reduction in her weekly rate. Mrs. Park did not give reductions easily, but she seemed to appreciate competence, and Faye was competent. Lily adored Mrs. Park, who was gruff and wonderful, and Mrs. Park tolerated Lily with a deeply hidden affection that she would have denied vigorously if accused of it. Dustfall, Faye began to understand, was a genuinely interesting town. It had a newspaper that Mr. Harold Teague put out every Thursday from a small office next to the Telegraph building. It had a doctor, Dr. Emmett Voss, who was young and nervous but thorough. It had a school that operated 3 days a week in the Methodist church when the Reverend was not using it. And Lily was still too young for school, but walked past it every morning and stared at the door with an expression of such passionate longing that it made Faye smile until her face hurt. And it had Isaac Mercer, who was everywhere and nowhere, who kept the peace with a combination of reputation and readiness that seemed to make actual violence unnecessary most of the time, and who Faye kept seeing from a distance and kept telling herself she was not watching for. She was watching for him. She hated herself a little for it, but she watched for him. She noticed that he came into the general store every Monday morning to pick up a supply order, which Mr. Finley prepared each Sunday night without being asked because the order never changed. She noticed that he drank coffee at the hotel dining room every morning at 6 o'clock, alone, and that he read the previous week's newspaper while doing it, always a week behind because he never had time to read it when it came out. She noticed that he always checked the lock on the bank door when he passed it, a gesture so habitual he probably did not know he was doing it. She noticed that he never looked at anyone for long. Not with the flat indifference of an unkind person, but with the particular avoidance of someone who has decided that seeing people clearly is too expensive. She understood that too. She had made the same decision herself, just for different reasons. It was on a Monday, 6 weeks after she had arrived, that the conversation happened. The real one. She was behind the counter when he came in for his supply order, and Mr. Finley was in the back dealing with a delivery, so Faye took the packaged order from the shelf and set it on the counter. Isaac came up and looked at it and then looked at her, and she met his eyes squarely, which she had noticed made him slightly uncomfortable in a way she found obscurely satisfying. "Mr. Finley says he added coffee to your order," she said. "Your usual amount ran out last week according to him." "Fine," Isaac said, a beat of silence. "You are settling in well," he said, which was the closest thing to personal conversation she had heard him attempt. "I am trying to," she said. "Any trouble?" She held his gaze. "Should I be expecting trouble?" Another one of those quick, complicated expressions. "This is a generally peaceful town, I keep it that way." "I am sure you do. But people who arrive in a hurry sometimes bring trouble with them," he said. "Not always, but sometimes." The air between them changed almost imperceptibly, the way air changes just before a storm. Faye felt it across her whole body, the moment when a conversation stops being a conversation and becomes something else. "I arrived on a mule," she said, keeping her voice very even. "With a child." "What kind of trouble do you imagine I am carrying?" "I do not imagine anything," Isaac said. "I observe." "And what have you observed?" He looked at her for a long moment. Not the quick cataloging look he usually gave people, something slower and more honest. "I have observed that you know where every exit is in every building you enter," he said. "I have observed that you sleep on the side of the bed closest to the door." Mrs. Park mentioned it, not as gossip, just as observation. "I have observed that your daughter knows not to draw attention to herself in ways that a child her age should not know. And I have observed that you keep your coat on even on warm days, which this past Tuesday was considerably warm." Faye's heart was doing something complicated inside her chest. She kept her face still. "You are very observant," she said. "It is my job." "Then let me be direct," she said, because she had been raised by a woman who believed in directness above all virtues. "I am not doing anything illegal. I am not planning to do anything illegal. I am a woman who has had a difficult year and who has come to Dustfall to start over with her daughter. That is the complete truth." "I believe you," he said, which surprised her. "You do?" I said. "I observe things, not that I cannot correctly interpret them." He picked up the supply order. "If you need anything, the sheriff's office is 3 buildings down." He left. Faye stood behind the counter for a moment with her hands very flat on the wooden surface, pressing down because she needed something solid. He believed her. He did not ask about the coat. He had left her space. She did not know what to do with that exactly, but she filed it away carefully. It was 2 weeks after that conversation, on a Sunday evening when the town was quiet, and the heat had finally eased into something approaching pleasantness, that Lily did the thing that changed everything. Faye had taken Lily for a walk after supper, which was something she did when the boarding house felt too small and her own thoughts felt too loud. They walked down the main street, which was mostly empty on Sunday evenings, and turned onto the quieter road that ran behind the church, where there were a few shade trees and a bench that someone had placed there years ago, for reasons nobody remembered anymore. Isaac Mercer was sitting on the bench. This was so unexpected that Faye actually stopped walking. He was not doing anything in particular. He was just sitting there in the fading light with his hat in his hands and his head slightly bent, looking at something in the middle distance that Faye suspected was not actually there, not in the physical sense. He looked, for possibly the first time since she had been aware of him, entirely unguarded. He looked, she thought, like a man who is very tired and has nowhere to put it. She would have turned around and given him his privacy except that Lily saw him first, and Lily, who was 4 years old and had not yet learned about the locked doors people put on themselves, said, "Hello, man with the pretty badge," and pulled free of Faye's hand and walked directly up to him. Isaac looked up. His face started to close off in the way she was accustomed to seeing it do, the automatic shuddering that he had clearly perfected over years of practice. And then, Lily did something that Faye would think about for years afterward. She climbed up onto the bench beside him, settled herself with the total physical confidence of a young child who has never been told her body does not belong somewhere. And she reached over and put her small hand on top of his large one where it rested on his knee. She did not say anything. She just put her hand on his. The shuddering stopped. Faye watched it stop, watched the process of closing off reverse itself in real time. Watched something move across Isaac Mercer's face that was so raw and so private that she felt she was witnessing something she had no right to witness, and she could not look away. He looked down at Lily's hand on his. He looked at it for a long time. His throat moved. "Hello," he said to Lily. His voice was different. Something had come loose in it. "Why are you sad?" Lily asked. "Lily," Faye said, her voice a soft warning. "I am allowed to ask," Isaac said quietly. He was still looking at Lily's hand on his. "It is a fair question." He paused. "I lost someone," he said, which Faye suspected was more than he had told most people. Lily considered this with great seriousness. "Did they go far away?" "Yes," he said. "Very far." "My mama says people who go far away are still in your heart," Lily said. Isaac finally looked up at Faye. She saw it again, that thing moving beneath his face. And this time she recognized it because she had felt the same thing herself, in the months after Thomas died. Not grief for Thomas, but grief for everything that had been lost before he died, for the woman she had been before she understood who he was. It was the look of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that the simple presence of another person noticing the weight is almost unbearable. "That is wise," he said to Lily. His voice was rough at the edges. "I know," Lily said pleasantly. "Mama is very smart." Faye put her hand over her mouth to contain what might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. Isaac looked at her again, and for the first time since she had known him, which was not very long but felt longer, he let her see him looking. He did not look away in 3 seconds. He held her gaze and she held his, and something passed between them that had no name in polite conversation. "Sit down if you like," he said, which was the most he had offered anyone in 5 years. Faye sat down on his other side. Lily, satisfied with the arrangement, began examining Isaac's hat, which he had set on the bench between them. She picked it up and put it on her head, where it fell down over her eyes, and she made no move to remove it, and Isaac looked at her, this tiny figure swallowed by his hat, and something happened to his face that Faye would have been willing to spend considerable time studying. "I am sorry for her presumption," Faye said softly. "I am not," he said. He meant it. They sat for a while in the evening quiet. The light moved from gold to orange to the deep pink that the Texas sky did in summer before going to purple. Lily fell asleep against Isaac's arm, her head drooping to his bicep, still wearing the hat, which should have been absurd and was instead one of the most naturally occurring things Faye had ever seen. Isaac went very still when the child's head touched his arm. Faye watched him. She watched him hold himself completely motionless, the way you hold yourself when you have a bird on your hand and you do not want to startle it away. "She does that," Faye said quietly. "Trusts people completely and immediately. I worry about it constantly." "She is right to trust," Isaac said. His voice was very low. "In this instance." "I know," Faye said. She had not known it actually. Not fully. But she knew it now, sitting in the last of the evening light with her daughter asleep against this man's arm, and the knowing settled into her like warmth into cold ground. They talked after that, not about anything of great consequence at first, about the town. About Mr. Finley's habit of describing things in enormous detail when a simple answer would suffice. About Mrs. Park's cooking, which was extraordinary and which she presented as though it were an obligation she found faintly irritating. About the summer heat and the way the canyon lands looked in the late afternoon when the red stone caught the light and everything went to fire and amber. And then, without quite planning it, they talked about real things. Isaac told her about Dustfall before he came, the violence and the fear that had settled into the town like a smell into wood. He told her about the previous sheriff, Garfield, not with the flatness he used when discussing most things, but with something in his voice that she recognized as grief that had been processed into something more useful. He told her about the work of keeping a town safe, which was less glamorous than its reputation and more exhausting, which was about knowing people and understanding what drove them to desperation, and working with that rather than against it when possible. He did not tell her about Clara. Not yet. But she felt her somewhere in the conversation, the shape of an absence, the way a missing tooth changes the whole architecture of a smile. Faye told him about San Antonio. Not all of it, not the parts about Thomas and Cutter Cross and the ledger sewn into her coat, but the true parts, the surface of the truth. She told him she had left a bad situation and was making something new. She told him that Lily was the reason she was still standing. She told him that Dustfall felt, for the first time in longer than she could comfortably calculate, like a place that might be worth staying in. He turned to look at her when she said that. A long, careful look. "I am glad to hear it," he said. 3 weeks after that evening on the bench, Cutter Cross's men found her. She knew they were in town before she saw them, because she felt the change in her own body the moment she woke up that morning, a tightening behind her sternum, the particular animal awareness that something has changed in the environment. She could not have explained it to anyone. She would not have had to explain it to Isaac, she thought, because he operated from the same kind of awareness. There were 2 of them. She spotted one from the general store window at 10:30, a heavy man in a yellow vest she had seen twice before in San Antonio, always at Cross's side. She did not know his name. Thomas had never introduced them, because Thomas had maintained the fiction, right up until the night before he died, that there was a clean separation between his home and his work, as though Faye were incapable of seeing through a fiction that thin. The second man she did not see until noon, when she went to collect Lily from Mrs. Parks for lunch, and saw him standing at the end of the street looking at the boarding house with the considering look of a man who is calculating something. She took Lily in the back door of the boarding house and told Mrs. Park in a very quiet voice that there were men in town who were looking for her, and that if they came to the door, Mrs. Park should tell them she had left 2 days ago. Mrs. Park, who was not a woman who frightened easily and who had, Faye suspected, seen a number of difficult things in 60 years of life, looked at her steadily and said, "You had better go tell the sheriff." "I am not sure," Faye began. "I am sure," Mrs. Park said. "Go," she went. She left Lily with Mrs. Park and walked the 3 buildings down to the sheriff's office with her hands steady and her jaw set, and the ledger pressed against her ribs inside her coat. And she pushed open the door to the office and found Isaac Mercer at his desk writing something. And he looked up, and whatever was in her face made him stand immediately. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything, not the parts. Everything. Thomas and Cutter Cross and the ledger and the 6 weeks running and the 2 men outside. She told it quickly and in order and without apology or self-pity, because there was no time for either. When she was finished, she reached inside her coat and withdrew the ledger, which was a flat book the size of a hymnal, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture, and set it on his desk. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You have been carrying this for 6 weeks, he said. Yes. That is why you kept the coat on. Yes. A brief silence. You could have come to me sooner, he said. I did not know you sooner, she said. Not enough. He acknowledged this with a nod. He picked up the ledger and opened it and looked at the first page, and his eyes moved down the columns of names and figures with the focused attention of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at. And she watched his expression solidify into something that was not quite anger, but was in the same family. Cutter Cross, he said. He said it the way you say the name of something serious. You know him. I know his name. His operation has been spreading east from El Paso for 3 years. I have been waiting for something to connect him to specific crimes. He looked at her. This connects him. What do I do? For right now, he said. You stay here. He deputized his assistant, a young man named Roy who was 18 and earnest and slightly too tall for his own boots, and sent Roy out with instructions she could not fully hear through the office wall. Then he came back in and sat across from her at his desk, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the space between them. I should have told you sooner, she said. Yes, he said without blame. But you told me now. Are Lily and I in danger? He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not simply reassure her, that he actually thought about it before answering. The men outside are here to retrieve the ledger and remove the risk you represent, he said. Which means yes, in the abstract. In the specific, I know who they are now, which means they will not find it easy to operate in this town. I do not want anyone hurt on my account. Nobody will be hurt, he said. I have dealt with men like this before. There was something in his voice that was not boasting. It was simply a statement of fact delivered by someone who understood the facts. She believed him, and believing him required no effort at all, which was, she thought, not nothing. The next 2 days were quiet in the specific way that things go quiet before they don't anymore. Roy tracked the 2 men to the saloon, where they were asking questions about new arrivals in town, describing a woman and a child. Isaac went to the saloon himself and had a conversation with the men that none of the patrons could hear, but which the bartender later described as the most polite threat he had ever witnessed, delivered with complete stillness and a hand resting on the butt of a revolver, and the result of which was that the men left Dustfall that afternoon on the North Road. But they would report back to Cutter Cross, and Cutter Cross would send more men or come himself. The ledger was too valuable to simply let go, and Faye was too dangerous alive. Isaac sent a telegraph to the United States Marshal's office in Fort Worth, citing the ledger as evidence of a federal criminal enterprise and requesting assistance. He sent a second telegraph to a contact he had in El Paso, a man named Walsh who had been trying to build a case against Cross for 2 years. And while they waited, he did something that Faye had not expected, which was that he became present. Not professionally present, not the way a lawman is present with a person under his protection, but genuinely, personally present in the way of someone who has decided to stop keeping a deliberate distance. He came by the general store each morning instead of just on Mondays. Not for long and not obviously, because he was not a man who did things obviously. Just a cup of coffee from the pot Mr. Finley kept on the cast iron stove, and 5 or 10 minutes at the counter, talking with Faye about whatever the day had in it. She began to understand him better during those morning conversations. She understood that his humor was dry and extremely quiet, so quiet that you could miss it entirely if you were not paying attention, and that it appeared rarely and without warning and was the more delightful for it. She understood that he was deeply fair-minded in his work, that he held himself to the same standard he held everyone else, which in a small town in 1882 was not as common as it should have been. She understood that he genuinely believed in the rule of law, not as an abstract principle but as a living practice, as something that had to be maintained every single day through consistent human action, or it would stop existing. She also understood that he was lonely. Not unhappy, not entirely, but lonely in the particular way of people who have sealed themselves off, and then continued living as though the sealing were a solution rather than a symptom. Lily helped with this. Lily, who had no concept of the locked and rusted things Isaac kept inside himself, simply proceeded on the assumption that he was hers to know, and therefore climbed onto his lap on 2 separate occasions when he visited the store, and asked him questions about his badge and his horse, and whether he had ever seen a bear and what bears smelled like. And Isaac answered all of these questions with a patience and a seriousness that Faye found quietly devastating. On the second occasion, when Lily had settled against his chest while he sat on a crate in the corner of the store and answered her 5th consecutive question about bears with perfect gravity, he looked up and found Faye watching him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the space between them was full of something enormous that neither of them had quite named yet. "She is extraordinary," he said. "She is," Faye said. "You are raising her alone." "I have been for a while." A pause. "That is too much for one person." "It is what there is," she said. "It does not have to be," he said, and he was not talking about the danger, she understood. He was not talking about Cutter Cross or federal marshals or any of the practical problems that had brought her to his office 3 weeks prior. He was talking about something else entirely, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to say it out loud yet, because some things need to be arrived at carefully. But it had been said. It was in the air between them, real as dust, real as heat, real as the sound of his boots on the boardwalk outside the store that she had begun to listen for in the mornings with a specificity she could no longer pretend was accidental. The thing she had been afraid of, the warm, specific awareness of a person, had become something she was not afraid of. That was the terrifying part. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after she had told him everything, when Delilah Holt walked into the saloon. Delilah Holt was not one of Cutter Cross's men. He was a different species of problem entirely. He was local. A cattle hand who had been fired from the Crawford Ranch 3 days prior for drunkenness, and who had come into town that afternoon in a state of considerable agitation, and had been at the saloon since noon, and had been drinking things that did not improve agitated states. Faye had taken Lily to the saloon not because she would normally take a 4-year-old into a saloon, but because Mr. Finley had asked her to deliver a package to the saloon's owner, a businesslike woman named Mrs. Kathleen Brand, who ran the establishment with considerable competence and from whom Mr. Finley regularly ordered certain supplies. Faye had thought it would take 5 minutes. It had taken 4. On the 5th minute, she was heading for the door with Lily's hand in hers when Holt, in whatever combination of rage and self-pity and bad whiskey he was operating under, stood up from his table and grabbed Lily's arm and pulled the child against him with one hand and put his gun to her head with the other, and shouted something about the Crawford Ranch and how nobody respected a working man and how he would have some respect now, or he would make them all very sorry. It had nothing to do with Faye. It had nothing to do with Cutter Cross. It was simply the worst possible thing at the worst possible moment, the specific and terrible randomness of violence that cannot be predicted or prevented, only survived. The room froze. Faye froze. She looked at her daughter's face, Lily's brown eyes wide and very still, not understanding but understanding in some animal way that this was danger, and she felt something cold and absolute move through her body. "Please," she said, moving toward him. "Please, she is all I have left." And then the doors opened, and Isaac Mercer was there. He took 3 steps forward, and the sound of his spurs was the only sound in the room, and he told Delilah Holt to put the child down. And Holt said what Holt said, and Lily turned her face and reached out her small hand toward Isaac across the distance of the room. What happened in the next 30 seconds happened very fast. Isaac's gun was already level. Holt's gun hand trembled, and Isaac saw the tremor, and he understood it for what it was, not resolve but fear dressed up as resolve, the worst kind of instability in a man with a gun. "Holt," Isaac said, and his voice was very different now, not the command voice but something quieter and more direct. "I know you. I know you worked the Crawford place for 6 years. I know you are not a man who would hurt a child." Holt's face did something complicated. "You do not know me." "I know you," Isaac repeated. He took 1 step forward slowly, and his gun did not move, but his voice had changed into something that was not a threat and was not a concession, but was something rarer than both, which was a recognition. "I know you are angry and frightened and you think you have run out of options, but you have not. Hurting this child is not an option. That is not who you are." Faye watched Holt's face, watched the gun waver. Watch the rage do what rage always does when it meets something it cannot find purchase on, which is begin to collapse. "Put her down," Isaac said quietly, "and we will talk. I give you my word." The gun came away from Lily's head. It took another 5 seconds, but it came away, and then Holt's arm loosened, and Lily dropped the 6 inches to the floor and immediately ran across the room to Faye, who caught her and held her so hard she probably left marks, and did not cry, absolutely refused to cry, at least not yet. Roy came through the back door at that moment and took Holt's arm, and the gun was on the floor, and it was over. Isaac walked across the room to Faye and Lily. He did not say anything. He just stood in front of them and he looked at Lily first, a quick examination, checking for harm, and then he looked at Faye, and she could see plainly in his face that the wall was not just cracked now. It was down, and he was not going to try to rebuild it. "You are both all right," he said. "We are," she said. Lily, still held against Faye's chest, looked at Isaac over her mother's shoulder. She reached out her hand again. Isaac took it, his large, work-roughened hand and her tiny one. He held it for a moment, looking at it, with that expression Faye had seen on the bench that first evening, that stripped and private look. "She is going to be the death of me," he said softly. He meant it as a joke, but there was something underneath it that was the opposite of death. That night, after Roy had Holt in a cell and the saloon had returned to its regular business, and the whole town had processed the afternoon in the way small towns process dramatic events, which is to say loudly and with embellishment, Isaac came to Mrs. Park's boarding house. He knocked on the door, and Mrs. Park let him in with the expression of a woman who is not surprised, and who has been expecting this and who may have opinions about it, but has decided to keep them in reserve for now. He sat in the small parlor off the entrance hall, and Faye came downstairs with Lily already in her nightgown, and Lily saw Isaac and said his name, which she had started using 2 weeks prior without asking permission, and climbed onto his lap with the assurance of someone exercising a long-established right. Isaac sat there with a 4-year-old in his nightgown on his lap, and looked at Faye, who sat down across from him. And for a moment the 3 of them were just there together in the lamplight of Mrs. Park's parlor while the sounds of the evening town filtered through the windows. "I want to tell you something," Isaac said. "All right," Faye said. "I had a wife," he said, "and a son. I lost them both 5 years ago." He said it the way you say something you have carried alone long enough that saying it out loud feels like setting down a stone. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what I am feeling is not something I feel easily. It is not something I have felt in a long time, and I would rather say it plainly than have you wonder." Faye looked at him across the lamplight. She was quiet for a moment because she was not going to respond to something that important with something inadequate. "I am sorry about your wife and your son," she said first, because that was first. "Genuinely," he nodded. "And I want to tell you something," she said. "I was married to a man who was a coward and a criminal, and who put me and my daughter in danger, and who I have been running from the consequences of for 6 months. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that, when I say I have never met anyone like you, I mean it as the most specific and complete truth I am capable of." They looked at each other for a long moment. Lily had fallen asleep in Isaac's lap. "I think," Isaac said carefully, "that I would like to be here, with you if you would have that." "I would have that," Faye said. "I would have that very much." The marshals arrived from Fort Worth 2 weeks later. There were 3 of them, led by a man named Marshal Daniel Price, who was competent and businesslike, and took the ledger from Isaac with the reverence a professional reserves for evidence that is going to make his career. Faye gave a full statement, which was recorded and witnessed, and Price told her that the United States government would subpoena her testimony for the federal case against Cutter Cross, but that her physical safety would be a federal concern, and Cross would be arrested before the case came to trial. Cross was arrested in El Paso 4 weeks after that. The arrest made the front page of Harold Teague's Dustfall Gazette, though it was the back page of the Dallas papers, because federal criminal cases were common enough in 1882 that they did not always get the front page. Isaac showed her the article over coffee at the hotel dining room, sliding the newspaper across the table without saying anything, and she read it and set it down and exhaled very slowly, as though she had been holding that breath for 6 months. She had been holding it for 6 months. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he confirmed. She looked at him across the table. "I suppose I have no reason to stay now," she said. She was testing something and they both knew it. "You have reasons," he said. "If you want them." She smiled at him. "Tell me the reasons." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers in a gesture so direct and unguarded that she felt it everywhere. "A general store that needs a counterwoman," he said. "A boarding house that has accepted you as practically family. A child who is going to start school next year at the Methodist Church," he paused, "and a sheriff who would like very much to stop eating breakfast alone." She turned her hand over under his so their palms were together. "Those are good reasons," she said. "I have more," he said. "Save them," she said. "For later. We have time now." They had time. That was the extraordinary thing. They had time, which was a luxury neither of them had ever had with each other before and which changed everything. Autumn came to Dustfall with the particular beauty that the Texas hill country puts on in October, when the post oaks go gold and the air loses its summer weight and the sky comes down 3 shades deeper blue. Isaac began coming to dinner at Mrs. Park's boarding house, which Mrs. Park permitted with the air of someone making a concession she finds perfectly reasonable. He and Faye walked in the evenings when his work allowed it, sometimes with Lily between them holding both their hands, swinging herself up over puddles and road ruts with the absolute faith of a child who knows she will be caught. Isaac bought a horse for Lily to learn on, a small spotted mare named Dolly who was patient and round, and who Lily loved with the passionate, uncomplicated love of a child for an animal. And on Saturday afternoons, he taught Lily to sit in the saddle in the paddock behind the livery, holding the lead and walking beside her with a patience that expanded to fill whatever space the task required. Faye watched from the fence rail and felt things she had not let herself feel in years, not since the early days with Thomas before she understood what he was, and those feelings were mixed up with so much grief and caution that she had sealed them away. What she felt watching Isaac Mercer walk circles in a paddock with her daughter in a saddle was entirely different in kind. It was clean. There was no contamination in it. She loved him. She let herself know it without fighting it, which took more courage than most of the things she had done in the past year. She told him on an evening in November, sitting on the bench behind the church where they had first really talked, which had become a place they went when the town felt too busy and they wanted to be just themselves. "I love you," she said. Directly, because she was her mother's daughter, and because she had learned that saying important things plainly is its own form of courage. "I know it is fast. I do not care about fast. I have had slow, and slow was dishonest. This is quick and it is honest, and I love you." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had moved him, and he was choosing the right words for it. "I have been thinking about this moment," he said. "About what I would say when it came. I have been thinking about it since that evening when Lily first put her hand on mine, and I understood that whatever I had locked away was not going to stay locked." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for longer than I have known what to do with it. I am not a man who says things for effect. I am saying this because it is the truest thing I know right now." She kissed him. The first time, sitting on a bench in the November evening while a cat watched them from the church steps with the indifference of cats, and it was not a small moment. It was the opposite of a small moment. It was the full weight of two people who have survived difficult things choosing, deliberately and with their eyes open, to move toward each other. He proposed on a Sunday in December in Mrs. Park's parlor, with Lily sitting on the rug playing with a collection of wooden animals that Isaac had carved himself over the course of 3 weeks, which Faye had discovered in his office by accident, and which had been the most unexpectedly moving thing she had ever found in a sheriff's desk drawer. He did it properly. He sat across from Faye and he said what he wanted to say without preamble, because he was a man who believed in plain speech for important matters. He told her that he wanted to marry her, that he wanted to be Lily's father in every way that mattered, that he was not asking her to forget who she had been or what she had survived, but to build something new with him, and that he believed the thing they could build would be stronger than anything either of them had managed alone. He had a ring. It had been his mother's. He had kept it in the same box where he kept the photograph of Clara and his son, and taking it out of that box and bringing it to Faye was an act of such profound intention that he had spent 3 nights lying awake being certain about it. Not doubting it, just being certain, which are different things. Faye looked at the ring, then at him, then at Lily, who had arranged all the wooden animals in a circle and was now looking up at her mother with enormous brown eyes that held a child's complete and unsentimental comprehension of what was happening. "Mama," Lily said. "Say yes." Faye laughed. She put her hand over her mouth and then she let herself laugh fully, which was one of the things Isaac loved most about her, that when she laughed, she gave herself over to it completely and the room came alive with it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." Isaac put the ring on her finger and Lily immediately climbed into his lap and said, "Now you are my papa," with the finality of a judge issuing a ruling. And Isaac put his arm around her and looked at Faye over the top of the dark curls, and whatever he said with his eyes in that moment required no translation. They were married in February of 1883, in the Methodist Church on a Thursday afternoon because the Reverend had a wedding already scheduled for Saturday and offered Thursday as an alternative. And Faye said Thursday was perfectly fine. She was not a woman who needed to wait for a Saturday. The whole town came, or near enough to it. Mr. Finley wept openly and attributed it to dust. Mrs. Park wore a dress that Faye had not seen before, and that was clearly being worn for the first time since a considerable occasion some years prior. And she sat in the front row with Lily beside her and held the child's hand with her characteristic brisk affection. Roy stood up with Isaac and held the rings with the focused gravity of someone entrusted with a significant military operation. Dr. Voss and Harold Teague and Kathleen Brand from the saloon, and the elderly man who had spent 7 minutes describing boot nails, all sat in the wooden pews and watched Isaac Mercer, who had stood alone against everything for 5 years, stand at the altar and let himself have something. Faye walked toward him in a dress she had made herself from a deep blue wool that Mr. Finley had set aside for her when a bolt arrived that was the exact color of the evening sky. And Isaac watched her come and did not look away once, which was the only vow he needed to make, really, though he made the others too. He made them with a steadiness that made everyone in the room believe them, because Isaac Mercer did not say things he did not mean and never had. And when he said, "I will," it sounded like the beginning of something rather than the end of a ceremony. Faye said hers looking him straight in the eye. Lily fell asleep in Mrs. Park's lap halfway through and had to be told about the best part later. They moved into the sheriff's house, which was a solid 2-story building at the end of the main street that had been sitting mostly empty since Isaac moved in 3 years prior, as he had never properly furnished it beyond a bed and a desk and a chair. Faye furnished it. She did this gradually and with considerable pleasure, acquiring things at the store and from the merchants who passed through town, building the inside of the house into something that had the warmth and the care that its outside had always lacked. Isaac watched this process with open fascination. He had been so long in empty spaces that the accumulation of ordinary domestic comfort was a thing that moved him in ways he had not expected. A rug by the fire, a curtain that caught the morning light, the sound of Lily's feet on the stairs, the smell of coffee in the morning when Faye made it, which was different from any coffee he had made himself, and he could not explain exactly why. Spring came. Lily started school at the Methodist church on the days the Reverend was not using it, and attended with a focus and a seriousness that made her teacher, a young woman named Miss Alice Crane who had come from Ohio, declare that she had rarely seen a child so genuinely interested in letters and numbers. And this pleased Isaac disproportionately, as though he had some personal stake in the outcome, which of course he did. He legally adopted Lily in April. The paperwork was handled by a circuit judge who passed through Dustfall every 6 weeks, and it was done matter-of-factly and without ceremony, except that when Isaac Mercer walked out of the judge's temporary office with the paper in his hand that said Lily was his daughter in the eyes of the law, he stood in the street for a moment and breathed carefully, and Roy, who happened to be nearby, had the decency to look at something in the opposite direction. Faye found out she was expecting in June. She told him in the evening in the kitchen, while he was cleaning his boots, which was something he did every evening as a habit so old he no longer noticed he was doing it. She said it plainly, because that was how she said things. And he set down the boot and the cloth and looked at her, and then stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands the way he did sometimes when something was almost too much, when the excess of what he felt needed to be contained and directed somewhere. "A child," he said. "Our child," she said. He kissed her forehead. "Are you well? Are you frightened?" She shook her head. "I have you," she said. "I am not frightened." He held her for a long time in the kitchen with the evening light coming through the window. They had put a curtain on together. The first curtain he had ever put up, a thing that had required 3 attempts and Faye's patient guidance and considerable laughter. Lily was told at breakfast the next morning, and her response was a 15-minute monologue on the subject of brothers versus sisters, the relative merits of each, and whether the baby would want to share her wooden animals, which Isaac had expanded to a small menagerie by this point. The animals, she had decided, were negotiable. Her room was not. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which was a mercy Faye did not take for granted. Dr. Voss was young but careful, and he came by regularly with the slightly anxious thoroughness of a doctor who has decided to be absolutely certain about everything. Isaac was present in the way of a man who is competent at most things and has a specific terror of this one, which Faye found endearing in a way she was careful not to tease him about too often. The baby came in late February of 1884, on a night when there was a cold wind off the plains and Lily was asleep upstairs, and Dr. Voss was present and steady, and Mrs. Park had installed herself in the kitchen without asking permission, which was the way Mrs. Park operated in a crisis. The baby was a boy. He was born at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he announced himself with considerable force, and Dr. Voss set him in Faye's arms, and Faye looked at him with the particular expression of a woman encountering something that is simultaneously entirely new and deeply familiar. And Isaac, sitting beside her with his hand in hers, looked at his son and felt the thing he had sealed away 5 years ago come fully and cleanly apart. Not in grief. In something that was its opposite, they named him James Isaac Mercer. Mrs. Park, when informed, made a sound that was not quite a sniff, but was adjacent to one, and then went directly to the kitchen, and made something elaborate for breakfast, which was the highest form of approval in her repertoire. Lily came downstairs in the morning to find her brother, and regarded him from a careful distance with the expression of a scientist examining a new specimen. She was 5 years old now, and attending school regularly, and had developed a very precise and methodical approach to evaluation. "He is very red," she said. "He will improve," Isaac said. "Will he be able to ride Dolly eventually?" "I will teach him," Lily said, with the authority of someone whose credentials in the field are unquestioned. She came closer and looked at James, who was asleep in Faye's arms with the dense unconsciousness of the newly born, and then she put her hand on his head with a gentleness that made both adults in the room completely still. "He is my brother," she said. "Not a question. A statement of possession, precise and total. He is," Faye said. Lily looked up at Isaac. "And you are still my papa." "I am always your papa," Isaac said. "That does not change, not for anything." She appeared satisfied by this, and climbed up onto the bed with a degree of careful negotiation for someone her size, and settled against her mother's side, and regarded her brother with the watchful attentiveness of someone who has just acquired a new responsibility and intends to take it seriously. Isaac sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the three of them, his wife and his daughter and his newborn son, in the February morning in the house that had been empty for 3 years and was not empty anymore, and the locked and rusted place in his chest was not just open now. It was unrecognizable. It had been rebuilt from the inside out into something entirely different, something that was not a lock at all. The spring of 1884 passed in the particular richness of a life that has stopped holding itself at a distance from its own happiness. Isaac's work did not change substantially. Dustfall was still dustfall, and there were still men who came into town with the intention of making trouble, and he still dealt with them with the same efficient nerve that had made his reputation. But he came home now, every evening reliably, with the spurs announcing him on the porch steps, and Lily would drop whatever she was doing and run to the door, and James, once he was old enough to sit up, would make sounds of greeting from wherever he had been placed, and Faye would look up from whatever she was doing with an expression that Isaac had never gotten used to and suspected he never would. He had not understood in the years before what he had been missing. Not precisely. He had understood that he was alone, and he had chosen aloneness as the preferable alternative to the risk of loss, which he had already proven he could survive only barely. What he had not understood was that aloneness was not a neutral state. It was its own kind of loss, slower and quieter but just as total, a loss of the person you could have been, the life you could have lived. He thought about this sometimes in the evenings, sitting on the porch with Faye after the children were in bed, in the cool dark of the Texas night with the stars spread out overhead the way stars spread out in open country, which is to say without apology. "What are you thinking about?" She asked him once. "Luck," he said. "Luck. That your mule brought you to Dustfall and not the next town." She was quiet for a moment. "That was not luck," she said. "What was it?" "I do not know exactly," she said, "but I think some things are meant to be found." "I think I was supposed to find you." He looked at her in the dark. "Even if it was luck," he said, "I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there on the porch in the warm dark while the town of Dustfall went about its evening, and the stars moved overhead in the slow clock of the sky, and somewhere inside the house James made a small sleeping sound, and Lily's lamp was still on upstairs because she was reading past her bedtime, which was a habit she had clearly inherited from nobody but herself. Isaac would get up in a few minutes and tell her to put out the lamp. He would climb the stairs and knock on the door and hear the quick rustle of a book being hidden under a pillow, which fooled neither of them. And he would put out the lamp and tell her good night, and she would hold his hand for a moment in the dark, the way she had that first evening on the bench, and then let go. He was not afraid of that anymore, the holding and the letting go. He had learned, through Faye and through Lily, and now through James, that love is not a ledger, that you do not end up with less of it by giving it out, that the opening of the heart is not the same as the breaking of it, even though the two feelings can seem identical at the start. Clara and their son lived in him still, and always would, in the part of a person that holds the things that cannot be undone. He had stopped running from that part. He visited it now, sometimes in the quiet moments, and he let it be what it was, which was grief and love combined into something permanent. And then he came back to the living because the living needed him. Faye knew about it. She knew the whole shape of his past because she was a woman who paid attention, and because he had told her all of it now, over the course of a year of evenings and conversations. The way two people who choose each other build their shared understanding not all at once but in layers, each layer making the next one possible. She carried her own past too. She had worked through it, not quickly or easily but steadily in the way she did most things. Thomas was a chapter she had closed because there was nothing more to do with it. The months of running, the fear and the exhaustion and the loneliness of being responsible for a small child in an increasingly dangerous situation, those had left marks as difficulties do. But marks are not wounds. She had come to understand the difference. She had come to understand a great many things, including that the life she had stumbled into by accident in Dustfall, Texas, was the life she would have chosen if she had known enough to choose it. The work at the general store, which she still did 3 days a week because she was good at it, and because Mr. Finley needed her, and because she found genuine satisfaction in the work. The friendship of Mrs. Park, who was not an easy woman to be friends with, but who was, underneath the compressed spring exterior, one of the most loyal people Faye had ever known. The small community of Dustfall itself, the ordinary life of a working town, the rituals of it, the gossip and the celebrations and the crises and the recoveries, and Isaac. Most of all, always, Isaac. She sometimes thought about the morning she had first seen him from the general store window, walking past with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what he is doing and where he is going. She had thought then that she understood him, that he was simple and hard and closed. She had been wrong in the most interesting way possible. He was complex and honest and more capable of tenderness than perhaps anyone in Dustfall had any idea, because he gave that tenderness only to the people who had earned it, and there were not many of them. And she was one of them, and Lily was one of them, and James would grow up drowning in it. He was also still the sheriff. He had been reappointed for a second term in the summer of 1884 by a town council that had not seriously considered anyone else, because the question of who kept Dustfall safe was not a complicated one. Roy had grown into a capable deputy, no longer too tall for his boots in the metaphorical sense if still somewhat in the literal one, and together they maintained the peace of a town that was growing and changing and occasionally difficult in the way of all living things. James took his first steps on a Sunday in December when he was 10 months old, launching himself from the rug toward his sister with the absolute reckless confidence of someone who has no clear understanding of gravity. And Lily caught him, and they both went down, and Lily laughed, and James laughed at her laughing. And Isaac picked them both up, and Faye stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded under her chin, watching the three of them in the afternoon light. Isaac looked up and saw her. He always saw her. She crossed the room to them, and he shifted James to one arm and put the other around her. And Lily wrapped herself around both their legs, which made walking technically impossible, but was not a problem they intended to address at this particular moment. "We should have more," Lily said, from somewhere around knee level. Faye and Isaac looked at each other above the crowded warmth of their children. "She may have a point," Faye said. "She usually does," Isaac said. "I am very smart," Lily confirmed. He bent and kissed Faye's temple, and then her cheek, and then the corner of her mouth. And she leaned into him with the full weight of someone who has stopped bracing for the fall, who knows that if she falls she will be caught, who has decided that this, right here, is solid ground. By the spring of 1885, Faye was expecting again. This time she told him in the morning at the kitchen table over coffee, and he set down his cup and looked at her with an expression that started dignified and arrived at delighted very quickly, which was a journey she enjoyed watching. Lily was told at breakfast, and took the news with the equanimity of someone who has already decided that more siblings are the correct policy. James, who was 14 months old and in possession of a vocabulary of approximately 12 words, said more. Upon seeing people eating, which was unrelated but felt thematically appropriate. The months moved through their seasons with the full, inhabitable beauty of a life that is actually being lived. Summer arrived and brought with it heat, and the smell of dry grass, and the sound of the mockingbirds that nested in the oak tree by the kitchen window. And Faye worked in the small garden she had planted behind the house, and James sat in the dirt beside her with a systematic interest in eating it. And Isaac came home every evening, and the spurs announced him on the steps. Lily turned 6 and started full school days when the town finally got a proper schoolhouse in August. A proper building this time, not the Methodist church. This was a development that had been discussed for 2 years, and funded through the efforts of a school committee that Faye had helped organize, because she believed, with the straightforward conviction of a practical person, that a child's access to education should not be dependent on the reverend's schedule. The schoolhouse was small and solid with 4 windows and a good stove for winter, and Miss Crane moved into it with the relieved efficiency of a teacher who has been waiting for a real building. Isaac walked Lily to school on the first day of the new schoolhouse. Faye walked on Lily's other side, with James on her hip. The 4 of them walked the 3 blocks from the sheriff's house to the new schoolhouse in the morning light, and Lily held both their hands and said nothing for most of the walk, which was unusual enough to be meaningful. At the door, she stopped and turned and looked up at them. "I will be fine," she said, with the seriousness of a child who is reassuring the adults. "We know," Faye said. "You can go," Lily said. "I do not need you to stay." "We know that too," Isaac said. Lily looked at him for a moment. 6 years old and standing straight with her satchel over her shoulder and her mother's eyes. "I am glad you did not give up," she said to him. "On the saloon day. I am glad you came." Isaac looked at his daughter and felt the full weight of what that afternoon had been, what it had resolved into, what it had become. He crouched down to her level. "I will always come," he said. "Do you understand me? Always." She nodded once, with the gravity of a child filing away a promise for permanent reference. Then she turned and went into the schoolhouse. Isaac stood up and found Faye watching him with James on her hip and her hand over her heart, and her eyes were bright. And she shook her head slightly as if she were dismissing something she had no business feeling in a public street, and he took her free hand, and they walked home in the morning light. The third child arrived in October, another boy, born with the emphatic punctuality of someone who has decided the timing is correct regardless of whether anyone else is ready. They named him Samuel, which was the name of Isaac's grandfather, a man he had never met but had been told about by his own father in terms of such consistent admiration that the name had weight. Samuel was, from the first week, a person of considerable opinions. He communicated these opinions loudly and clearly at all hours, in contrast to James, who was a placid and philosophical child, and Lily, who had been so quiet as an infant that Faye had sometimes held her breath with worry. Samuel had no interest in quiet. He arrived in the world like a statement, and proceeded accordingly. Isaac held him on the second night, sitting by the fire while Faye slept, which she needed desperately, and walked the small circle of the sitting room with Samuel against his chest, listening to the child gradually wind down from outrage to mere dissatisfaction to a tentative sleep, and he thought about all of it, all the improbable turns that had led to this moment, this room, this child. He thought about the morning he had seen the mule tied outside the livery stable, and noted the woman and the small girl in the way he noted everything, neutrally, as data. He could not have imagined. He would not have thought to imagine it. He had closed the part of himself that imagined futures. And then a child had put her hand on his, and something had cracked open, and everything that had come after had come from that. From 4 small fingers and the absolute trust of a person too young to understand why trust is dangerous. He was grateful for that trust every single day. The years and dustfall continued to move with the accumulating richness of a life that has found its proper shape. Isaac served as sheriff for another 4 years, until 1887, when he was 39, and the town had grown considerably, and the work had expanded beyond what one man and 1 deputy could reasonably manage. He hired 2 more deputies, both of them young men he trained himself with the same precision and fairness he applied to everything, and reorganized the office into something that could function without being entirely dependent on any one person's presence. He also, in 1887, accepted an invitation from the town council to serve as a justice of the peace in addition to his sheriffing duties, which suited him, because the work of law had always interested him more for its purpose than its drama. And the purpose was order and fairness, and the protection of the people who were unable to protect themselves. Faye ran for a seat on the school board in 1888 and won by a substantial margin, which surprised no one who knew her. She served on the board with the same combination of thoroughness and directness that characterized everything she did, and she advocated persistently for a second teacher, when the school's enrollment outgrew what one person could reasonably manage. And she got the second teacher in 1889, a patient man from Virginia named Mr. Thomas Webb, who was very different from Thomas Dalton in every way that mattered. Lily was 10 by then, and had developed a ferocious love of mathematics that filled her teachers with a combination of admiration and mild exhaustion. James was 6 and had inherited his father's quality of stillness, that watchful, accurate perception of the world that made him seem older than he was. Samuel was 4 and in possession of approximately 17 strong opinions about everything, most of which he expressed without hesitation. The house at the end of the main street was full. There was noise and activity, and the particular organized chaos of a household with 3 children. And Faye managed it with the same efficient competence she brought to everything, though she would have been the first to say that managing it was the wrong word, that what she was doing was not managing so much as inhabiting, which is different. She had a conversation with Isaac one evening that she thought about later as the conversation that summed up everything. It was after supper, after the children were in bed, which was the hour they kept for themselves with the fidelity of people who understand that a marriage requires tending. They were on the porch in the summer dark, and dustfall was quiet around them, and the stars were out, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle, quiet and far away. "Are you happy?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment in the way he considered real questions. "I did not think I would be," he said. "I had decided that happiness was not something I was going to have again. I had made peace with that, or what I told myself was peace. And now," he looked at her in the dark, "now I understand that what I called peace was just the absence of hope. And this," he said, meaning all of it, the house and the children and her and the life they had built together in this specific town in this specific time, "this is not the absence of anything. This is the full presence of everything." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I reached for you first," she said, "but Lily reached first." "Lily always reaches first," he said. She laughed softly, and he pulled her closer, and the fiddle played on down the street in the warm dark of the Texas summer. And inside the house that had been empty for years, James and Samuel and Lily slept in their rooms, and the wooden animals stood in their parade on the shelf in Lily's room, and the curtain that had taken 3 attempts to hang moved gently in the window above the kitchen sink. Isaac pressed his lips to the top of Faye's head and held them there for a moment, the way he did when something was too large for words, when the feeling exceeded the vocabulary available to it, when the only honest response was this: presence, warmth, the uncomplicated weight of being exactly where you are supposed to be. In the spring of 1890, Lily Mercer stood at her bedroom window and looked out over the main street of Dustfall, Texas, and thought about mathematics, which was a thing she was going to study in earnest when the time came, because her mother had already written 3 letters to schools in Austin and Dallas, and 1 in St. Louis, asking what the options were for a girl who was exceptionally good at numbers, and intended to do something with it. Her father had read those letters before they were sent, and had added a line to each, in his precise handwriting, stating his full support, which meant something in 1890 in Texas, when a lawman's endorsement carried weight. She had not asked him to. He had done it because it was right. That was who her father was. She thought about the day she had walked out of the general store and seen a man with a pretty badge walking past, and had not thought twice about going straight up to him, because she had been 4 years old and had not yet learned to hold herself back from the things that called to her. She did not know, then, what she was reaching toward. She only knew it was safe. She knew it still. She turned away from the window and ran down the stairs, because breakfast was ready and her brothers were already at the table and Samuel was almost certainly trying to take her biscuit. Isaac Mercer was in the kitchen pouring coffee when she came in, and he looked up, and he smiled at her with the smile that had taken her 4 years to earn, and that she still considered one of her finest achievements. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Papa," she said, and sat down to breakfast with her family in the house that had been empty once and was empty no longer.